March 4, 1943. 23,000 feet above the German industrial heartland, the air is so cold it burns. Inside the cramped nose of a B-17 flying fortress, Bombardier Lieutenant James Hartley watches his breath crystallize against the plexiglass. Below him, somewhere beneath an unbroken carpet of gray clouds stretching to every horizon, lies the Ruhr Valley, the beating heart of Nazi Germany's war machine. 32 bomber crews, nearly 320 men, have flown 7 hours through flak and fighters to reach this moment. But Hartley cannot see his target. He cannot see the ground. He cannot see anything but clouds. His hand hovers over the bombsight, a precision instrument rendered useless by weather. In his headset, the pilot's voice crackles. "We've got maybe 90 seconds of fuel safety margin. Your call, Lieutenant." The formation circles, burning fuel, burning time. While fighters scramble from airfields, Hartley can only imagine beneath that impenetrable white. The mission parameters are clear. Visual confirmation required. Without eyes on target, protocol demands they abort, carry their bombs home, and add another failure to a growing ledger of raids turned back by European weather. Hartley stares at the clouds. The clouds stare back, keeping their secrets. But today is different. Today, tucked into the radio operator's compartment behind him, mounted in a plywood rack and wired into the aircraft's electrical system, with all the elegance of a field modification, sits a box that hums. Not loudly, just a persistent, high-pitched whine that crew members have learned to ignore. Inside that box, a piece of copper barely the size of a man's thumb pulses with microwave energy, sending invisible fingers down through the weather, through the clouds, through the very air itself, and painting on a small circular screen what human eyes cannot see: the geometry of the earth below. Roads, rivers, the angular shadows of factory buildings. The Bombardier has never used anything like it. Most Bombardiers in the European theater have never even heard of it. But in 90 seconds, James Hartley will make history not because he can see through clouds, but because a broken laboratory experiment 3 years earlier taught a cavity magnetron to do it for him. This is not a story about a single bomb run. This is the story of how desperation, salvaged failure, and a handful of physicists who barely understood what they had created gave the Allied air campaign an eye that could pierce the impenetrable, and in doing so, transformed the entire calculus of strategic bombing. It begins not in the sky over Germany, but in a basement laboratory in Birmingham, England, where 2 men tried to build something impossible and accidentally changed warfare forever: the magnetron that wasn't supposed to work. Britain stands alone. France has fallen. The Luftwaffe owns the skies over the Channel, and every night German bombers carve London into rubble. The Royal Air Force bleeds pilots faster than training schools can replace them. Churchill's strategists understand with brutal clarity that Britain cannot win a defensive war. If the island is to survive, it must take the war to Germany, must strike the factories, the rail yards, the infrastructure that feeds Hitler's war machine. But night bombing is guesswork. Crews navigate by dead reckoning and drop their payloads on city glows, hoping the fires they start are in the right postal district. Accuracy is measured in miles, not meters. And daylight bombing? Daylight bombing is suicide without fighter escort, and Britain's fighters lack the range to accompany bombers deep into occupied Europe. The problem, at its core, is vision, or rather the lack of it. Clouds cover northern Europe 7 days out of 10. Darkness swallows the other 3. What the RAF needs, what every air force in the world needs but cannot build, is a way to see through weather, through darkness, through smoke and haze and all the atmospheric conspiracies that shield targets from bombardiers. They need radar, but radar in 1940 is a crude instrument, effective for detecting large objects at long range but incapable of the resolution required to identify a specific factory from 10,000 feet. The wavelengths are too long, the antennas too large, the power too diffuse. Physics, as much as engineering, imposes the limit. At the University of Birmingham, John Randall and Harry Boot are not trying to solve the bombing problem. They are trying to build a better microwave transmitter for experimental radar research. Working under a grant so modest, they purchase materials with personal funds when departmental budgets run short. Microwave radar, radar operating at wavelengths measured in centimeters rather than meters, promises revolutionary resolution. But generating sufficient microwave power has stumped engineers on both sides of the Atlantic. The theoretical designs demand vacuum tubes with impossibly tight tolerances and cooling systems that would require a power plant. Randall and Boot approach the problem differently. They resurrect a nearly forgotten device called a cavity magnetron, a design so old it predates the First World War, and they begin tinkering. The magnetron is, in principle, absurdly simple: a cylindrical vacuum chamber with a cathode at the center and an anode wrapped around it. Apply voltage, generate a magnetic field perpendicular to the electric field, and electrons spiral outward in a cloud, oscillating as they go. Couple that oscillation to resonant cavities carved into the anode, and in theory, you get microwave emission. The problem is that every previous magnetron design produces negligible power, radiates inefficiently, and burns out within hours. Randall and Boot do not solve these problems so much as stumble around them. They machine their cavities differently. They adjust the magnetic field strength by trial and error, guided more by intuition than calculation. They solder connections that, by the strict standards of electrical engineering, should not work. On February 21, 1940, they flip the switch. The magnetron hums, then screams. The ammeter needle slams against its stop. The output, measured hastily with instruments not designed for such readings, exceeds 400 watts at a wavelength of 9 centimeters. 400 watts. Previous magnetrons had produced milliwatts. Randall and Boot stare at their creation, uncertain whether they have built something brilliant or something about to explode. They run the test again. Same result. They adjust the voltage. The power climbs. They adjust the magnetic field. The frequency shifts, but the power remains stable, impossibly stable, hour after hour. They have created a device that should not work, that violates no laws of physics but defies every expectation of engineering, that pumps more microwave energy into a coherent beam than any instrument in the world. And they have no idea what it is good for. The military applications come later, proposed by strategists who understand that a radar set capable of centimeter wavelength resolution could map terrain, identify ships in fog, guide artillery through smoke. But even then, even as British intelligence rushes the magnetron design to allies and fabricators, no one quite grasps the specific, war-changing application that will define its legacy. The breakthrough is treated as a tactical advantage, a tool for coastal defense and night fighters. It takes American engineers working in laboratories outside Boston with access to manufacturing infrastructure Britain lacks to realize that Randall and Boot's broken laboratory experiment can be miniaturized, ruggedized and mounted in the nose of a bomber. They call it H2S in Britain, a designation chosen for security reasons and rumored to reference the phrase "home sweet home" for its navigation applications. The Americans, with their preference for blunt nomenclature, call it H2X or Mickey, but the crews, the men who fly with it and depend on it and watch its ghostly green display paint targets they cannot see, call it by a simpler name: the device that sees through clouds. American air power doctrine in 1942 rests on a seductive theory that strategic bombing, conducted at high altitude in daylight with precision bomb sights, can dismantle an enemy's industrial capacity without resorting to the indiscriminate city burning the RAF practices by night. The Norden bombsight, that marvel of gyroscopes and mechanical computation, promises accuracy within 100 feet from 20,000 feet altitude, promises, in the dry language of procurement manuals, that a trained bombardier can drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. The doctrine is humane in its way. It targets factories, not neighborhoods, ball-bearing plants, not cathedrals. It is a theory of war that allows American planners to sleep at night, secure in the belief that their bomber offensive will be, if not moral, then at least measured. But the theory encounters reality over Europe, and reality is uncooperative. The Norden bombsight requires visual acquisition. It requires the bombardier to see his target, to align crosshairs, to adjust for wind and altitude and the bomber's drift. It requires above all clear skies, and Europe does not provide clear skies. Northern Europe, in particular, offers cloud cover 200 days a year. Thick overcast that turns the Norden sight into an expensive paperweight. Mission after mission launches, penetrates German airspace, faces flak and fighters and the grinding tension of combat flight, only to circle fruitlessly above clouds and return with full bomb bays. The aborted mission rate in 1942 hovers above 40%. Commanders tear their hair. Crews grow cynical. The doctrine of precision, they mutter in ready rooms, is just a doctrine, a beautiful theory murdered by ugly weather. German defenders, meanwhile, learn to love clouds. Flak batteries position themselves near industrial targets, but their effectiveness doubles when bombers must fly straight and level for extended periods, searching for gaps in the overcast. Luftwaffe fighter controllers vector their interceptors into patrol zones below cloud decks, knowing American formations will eventually descend to identify targets, trading altitude and safety for visibility. Weather becomes a strategic asset for the Reich, as valuable as any fighter wing. Intelligence reports reaching Berlin note with satisfaction that Allied bombing accuracy degrades to near uselessness in overcast conditions, that the vaunted American precision campaign achieves precision only when nature permits. The introduction of H-2X changes this calculus overnight, though the change is neither immediate nor obvious. The first operational sets arrive in England in late 1943, installed in lead bombers designated as pathfinders. The technology is classified at levels reserved for code-breaking secrets. Crew members selected to operate the equipment sign secrecy oaths and receive briefings emphasizing that the device's existence must not be disclosed under any circumstances, even under interrogation if captured. They are told in language deliberately vague that the equipment uses radio echoes to create images of the ground. They are not told how it works. Most of them, farm boys from Iowa and mechanics from Pittsburgh, neither know nor care. What they care about is that the circular display, glowing green in the darkened bombardier station, shows them what their eyes cannot. The shapes of coastlines, the grid of city streets, the bright return of a rail marshalling yard. It is not easy to use. The images are crude, smeared, open to interpretation. An experienced operator learns to distinguish a river from a canal by the width of the dark line on the scope, to identify factory districts by the dense clusters of angular returns, to separate the echo of a town from the echo of a forest. It requires hours of study, comparing radar images to reconnaissance photographs, building a mental library of how terrain translates into microwave reflections. Some bombardiers take to it naturally, developing an almost intuitive sense for reading the ghostly topography. Others struggle, seeing only meaningless static and wash out of pathfinder training. But those who master it, those who learn to see through the magnetron's electric eye, become invaluable. They become the men who lead formations through solid overcast to targets no one else can find. The operational doctrine evolves rapidly. Pathfinder aircraft equipped with H-2X fly at the front of the formation. The lead bombardier acquires the target on radar, calculates the approach, and releases his bombs. The rest of the formation, flying tight and trusting their lead, toggles on his release. It is not as precise as visual bombing. The Norden's 100-foot promise becomes a 1,000-foot reality, sometimes wider, but 1,000 feet is infinitely better than nothing. It is better than aborting. It is better than guessing, and critically it means that weather no longer dictates mission planning. Targets previously considered impractical in winter months become viable year-round. The operational tempo increases. The pressure on German industry becomes unrelenting. The first mission's expectation and reality. The crews expect magic. They have been told, carefully, obliquely, through the rumor networks that constitute unofficial communication in military hierarchies, that a new technology exists, that some bombers carry equipment capable of bombing through clouds, that the weather will no longer ground the offensive. They expect, because young men in desperate circumstances always expect, that this new device will make their jobs easier, safer, less terrifying. They expect that blind bombing means the fighters will not find them, that the flak will fire blind, that missions will shorten and casualty rates will drop. They learn otherwise quickly. The first large-scale radar-led mission targets Bremen, an industrial port city on Germany's northern coast. December 13, 1943, 360 bombers, the largest daylight formation yet assembled, lumber into German airspace under solid cloud cover stretching from the Channel to the Baltic. The Pathfinder crews, flying B-17s with H-2X installations, take their positions at formation leads. In the nose of one such lead ship, a bombardier named Captain William Rothman watches his radar scope and tries to ignore the flak bursts he can hear but not see, detonating somewhere in the gray void around him. The scope shows Bremen's harbor, the distinctive fork of the Weser River, the dense urban return of the city center. He adjusts his approach, aligns his heading, and at 12:17 hours releases. Behind him, 359 other bombardiers watch their leads bomb bay and toggle when his bombs fall. 1,400 tons of high explosive and incendiaries tumble through the clouds, invisible to the men who dropped them, falling toward a city the attackers never see. Rothman does not know if he hit. None of them know. They turn for home, chased by fighters that appear like sharks from below the overcast, and they do not learn the results until reconnaissance aircraft fly the next morning and photograph the damage. The photos show impacts scattered across a 3-mile radius. Some bombs cratered factory districts. Others fell in residential areas on parks on the river itself. The rail yards, the primary target, suffered moderate damage enough to disrupt operations for a week. Strategic analysts call it a success. They cite the tonnage dropped, the fires started, the symbolic value of striking a target previously shielded by weather. But Rothman, looking at the reconnaissance images in debriefing, sees the scatter pattern and feels a cold recognition settle in his chest. They had not achieved precision. They had achieved presence, persistence, the ability to strike. But the promise of the Norden sight, that dream of the pickle barrel, has not been restored by radar. It has been replaced by something different. The ability to hit approximately the right city, approximately the right district, reliably and regardless of weather. The psychological impact on German defenders is more significant than the physical damage. For months, the Luftwaffe and Flak Corps have relied on weather forecasts to predict safe days, days when clouds would keep the Americans grounded or force them to abort. Suddenly, the weather provides no protection. Bombers appear overhead in conditions that should make accurate bombing impossible, and bombs fall anyway. The raids are less accurate, yes, but they are constant. Factory managers who once relaxed during overcast spells now keep workers in shelters. Production schedules disrupted not by hits, but by the mere possibility of hits. The psychological term for this is operational friction. The degradation of effectiveness caused not by direct destruction, but by sustained threat. H2X, even in its crude initial application, generates enormous friction. The crews, meanwhile, discover that blind bombing does not mean safe bombing. Flak batteries fire barrage patterns based on radar tracking of the formations themselves, filling probable flight paths with steel regardless of visibility. Fighters use ground-controlled intercept radar to position themselves along known approach routes, then climb through the overcast to attack from below. If anything, the danger intensifies because the bombers must fly longer, more predictable paths to allow the radar bombardier time to identify and lock the target. The tight formations required for effective follow-the-leader bombing make them more vulnerable to fighters. Men still die, aircraft still fall, and the crews learn that technology has not eliminated terror. It has merely changed its shape. What they expected, that science would protect them. What they experience, that science gives them the capacity to persist in conditions that should ground them, to press attacks that should be impossible, to turn weather from an enemy into an irrelevance. But persistence is not protection. The missions continue. The losses continue. And the men flying them begin to understand that the Magnetron has not made bombing easier. It has made it inevitable. The transformation of air power. By mid-1944, H2X is standard equipment on Pathfinder aircraft across the 8th Air Force. Production has scaled, training has systematized, and the operational procedures have been refined through hard experience. The transformation in strategic bombing capability is less dramatic than revolutionary. A steady, relentless expansion of what is possible. Targets once bombed only in summer now face raids year-round. Industrial centers deep in Germany, previously shielded by their distance and the likelihood of bad weather over the flight path, find themselves under attack in January as readily as July. The cumulative pressure begins to warp German industrial output, not through catastrophic single strikes, but through the grinding certainty that no facility is safe, no production schedule secure. German engineers attempt countermeasures. They experiment with radar-absorbent smoke screens, with decoy heat sources meant to create false returns, with chaff dispensers that fill the air with aluminum strips to clutter radar displays. Some of these measures work marginally. Most do not. The frequency and resolution of H2X make it difficult to deceive. A smeared urban return looks different from a cloud of chaff. A river's persistent dark line cannot be mimicked by smoke. And the Allies adapt, introducing new versions of the equipment with improved resolution, with different frequency bands to counter jamming attempts, with better displays and more intuitive controls. The transformation extends beyond bombing accuracy. H-2X becomes a navigation tool, allowing bombers to fix their positions over blacked-out Europe with unprecedented accuracy. Formations no longer rely solely on dead reckoning and celestial navigation, methods prone to cumulative error over long missions. A radar operator can identify a coastline, a city, a distinctive terrain feature, and update the navigator's plot in real time. The rate of bombers lost to navigation error, running out of fuel searching for home bases, ditching in the North Sea, straying into neutral airspace, drops dramatically. Crews begin to trust the technology, to bet their lives on the accuracy of a display they do not fully understand, generated by principles of physics they could not explain. There is a historical irony here, bitter and precise. The technology that enables all-weather bombing is born from a laboratory accident, a device that worked when it should not have, refined in desperation and deployed out of necessity. It is not the product of methodical scientific progress but of improvisation, and yet it achieves what methodical programs could not. The cavity magnetron, that humming copper slug, outperforms theoretically superior designs. The H-2X radar, cobbled together from British concepts and American manufacturing, outperforms targeting systems that cost 10 times as much and required years more development. The lesson, that war accelerates innovation not through planning but through pressure, through the collision of necessity and chance, is one historians will debate for decades. For the men who fly the missions, the lesson is simpler. The box that hums in the radio compartment is the difference between a milk run and an abort, between hitting something and hitting nothing. They do not romanticize it. They do not name it or paint nose art celebrating it. It is simply there, humming, painting its green images, allowing them to do the job they were sent to do. If it breaks, technicians repair it. If it malfunctions, they abort or bomb by estimate. But when it works, when the operator calls target acquired, over the intercom and the bombardier watches the synthetic landscape crawl across his scope, they trust it with the same faith they trust their engines, their oxygen, their parachutes. It is equipment. It is essential. It is, by 1944, as fundamental to the bomber offensive as bombs themselves. Symbolism, the eye that never blinks. Throughout the campaign, one image recurs in mission reports and crew debriefings. In the letters men write home when censorship permits vague references to technology, the eye. The radar scope, glowing green in the darkness of the bombardier station, becomes in their language and their understanding an artificial eye, an inhuman eye that sees what human vision cannot. It does not tire. It does not flinch at flak bursts or fighter attacks. It does not suffer from fear or fatigue or the physiological limits of biology. It simply sees persistently and without emotion, translating the invisible into the visible. This eye becomes a symbol of a broader transformation in warfare, the introduction of technologies that extend human capability beyond natural limits, that create new forms of perception and action. The men operating the equipment are neither artists nor scientists. They are technicians, trained to interpret a specific kind of data, to translate radar returns into targeting solutions. But they are also, in a sense, the first generation of human operators merged with machine perception. Their effectiveness dependent on their ability to read and trust information generated by a process they witness only as output. They do not see microwaves. They do not perceive the electromagnetic echo. They see only the display, and they must believe that the display represents truth. The German defenders understand this symbolism, perhaps more clearly than the attackers. Intelligence reports captured after the war describe Allied radar capabilities in terms both technical and philosophical, noting that the introduction of centimetric radar represents a fundamental shift in the nature of aerial warfare. Weather, darkness, and smoke, the traditional allies of the defender, lose their value. The advantage shifts to the attacker, who can choose when and where to strike without regard for visibility. The reports describe this not as a tactical problem, but as a strategic crisis, a development that invalidates existing defensive doctrine. There is a deeper symbolism, too, in the origin of the magnetron itself, a device born from salvage failure, From the resurrection of an abandoned design, from the willingness of two researchers to pursue an avenue orthodox science had dismissed. The narrative of H2X is not a story of genius inventing perfection. It is a story of iteration, of failed experiments re-examined, of accidental success analyzed and exploited. The cavity magnetron works because Randall and Boot did not know enough to believe it could not work, because they approached an old problem without the baggage of received wisdom. This, too, becomes part of the mythology, that the weapon which helped win the strategic bombing campaign was built by men who did not fully understand what they had created until after it worked. For the crews, the eye that never blinks is also a burden. It removes their last excuse for failure. Weather can no longer save them from the mission. Clouds can no longer turn a raid into a reconnaissance flight. If the equipment functions, they must press the attack. The responsibility shifts from nature to technology, and from technology to the men operating it. When bombs miss, it is not because the target was obscured. It is because the operator misread the scope. The bombardier miscalculated the approach, the equipment malfunctioned. The radar gives them capability, and capability imposes obligation. April 25, 1945. The war in Europe has 2 weeks left, though the men flying over what remains of the Reich do not yet know this. Berlin is a ruin. Its government fled to bunkers or dead in the rubble. The industrial cities of the Ruhr are silent. Their factories shattered, their rail yards cratered beyond repair. There are fewer targets now, and the missions have a perfunctory quality, striking at remnants, at pockets of resistance, at infrastructure that will never rebuild. But the missions continue because the war is not officially over. And until it is, the bombers fly. Over Pilsen, in what will soon again be Czechoslovakia. A formation of B-17s approaches through dense overcast. The lead bombardier, a lieutenant on his 47th mission, watches his H2X display with the bored competence of a man who has done this too many times. The Skoda works appears on his scope, a dense cluster of returns beside the river. He adjusts his heading mechanically, releases and banks away. Behind him the formation follows. The bombs fall through clouds and the crews turn west toward England, toward beds and debriefing and the rumor that the war will end any day now. The lieutenant does not think about the Magnetron humming behind him. He does not think about Randall and Boot in their Birmingham laboratory, about the engineering teams in Boston, who turned a laboratory curiosity into operational hardware, about the physicists and technicians whose work made this mission possible. He thinks about the number 47, about the approaching end, about the fact that he has survived when so many have not. The green scope flickers, painting targets he no longer sees as targets, merely as returns, as problems of geometry and timing. But the raid is successful. Post-war analysis will determine that the Skoda Works, one of the last functioning armament factories in German-controlled territory, suffers catastrophic damage from this mission. Production ceases. The war effort, already collapsing, loses another fragment of capacity. It is not the dramatic strike that history remembers. It is one raid among thousands, differentiated only by its lateness, by its position near the end of a campaign that killed hundreds of thousands and reshaped the industrial geography of Europe. The story of H2X is not, ultimately, about a single device. It is about the intersection of desperation and innovation, about the way war forces technology to leapfrog generations of development, about the transformation of strategic bombing from a fair-weather tactic to an all-weather certainty. It is about the men who flew with equipment they did not understand, who trusted machine perception over their own eyes, who became the first generation of hybrid operators, part pilot, part technician, part interpreter of invisible spectra. The cavity magnetron, that broken experiment that worked when it should not have, changed the war in ways both measurable and subtle. It did not win the war alone. No technology does. But it removed weather as Germany's ally, turned clouds from shields into irrelevances, and gave Allied commanders the ability to maintain unrelenting pressure regardless of season or sky. It transformed the nature of strategic bombing from precision strikes dependent on perfect conditions to persistent campaigns that ground down industrial capacity through sheer, relentless presence. And it began with 2 men in a basement laboratory with a piece of copper, with a hunch that an old design might work if they changed it just slightly. They flipped a switch, and the magnetron screamed to life, pumping 400 watts of microwave power into an uncertain future. They could not have known that their experiment would become the eye that sees through clouds, the device that would guide thousands of tons of bombs to thousands of targets through weather that should have made bombing impossible. They only knew they had built something that worked when it should not have. That, in the end, is the deeper truth. That the margins between failure and revolutionary success are often thinner than we imagine. That the technologies which reshape warfare are sometimes salvaged from the scrap heap of abandoned ideas. That the most significant innovations come not from perfect planning, but from the willingness to try something that should not work and discover, against all expectation, that it does. Lieutenant Hartley, circling over the Ruhr in March 1943, did not think about any of this when he toggled his bombs based on a radar image. He thought about getting home, but he was in that moment performing an act that would have been impossible 3 years earlier, dropping bombs with acceptable accuracy through clouds, using microwave radiation generated by a device that its inventors barely understood. The magnetron hummed behind him, painting invisible pictures, seeing through the impenetrable, making the impossible routine. The war ended. The mission stopped. The bombers came home or did not, but the eye that learned to see through clouds, that technological leap born from a broken experiment, persisted. It evolved into the radar systems that guide aircraft today, into the imaging technologies that map planets and peer through jungle canopy, into the synthetic aperture systems that paint Earth's surface from orbit. The principle remains: electromagnetic radiation, transmitted and received, translated into images that extend human perception beyond the visible spectrum. And somewhere in the history of that technology, in the genealogy of every radar system that sees through weather and darkness and atmospheric interference, is a moment in February 1940 when John Randall and Harry Boot, working in a basement with second-hand equipment and a grant that barely covered materials, flipped a switch and heard their magnetron scream. They did not know they were changing warfare. They only knew they had built something extraordinary, something that worked by rules they had not fully deciphered, something that generated more power than theory suggested was possible. They built an eye that could pierce clouds, and in doing so they gave an entire air campaign the gift of sight, the ability to strike regardless of weather, the capacity to make bombing not occasional but inevitable. The cost was measured in cities destroyed and lives ended. The benefit was measured in a war shortened, in industrial capacity shattered, in a conflict that might have dragged on years longer, had weather remained Germany's silent ally. History does not record whether Randall and Boot understood the full implications of their work. History records only that they succeeded, that their device functioned, that it propagated through military channels and emerged as operational hardware on bombers flying through European skies. The rest, the missions, the targets, the transformation of strategic bombing, followed from that initial success, that moment when a laboratory experiment became a weapon. And so the story ends where it began, with clouds, with the need to see through them, with the men and machines that made seeing possible. The B-17s returned to their bases or fell in flames over Germany. The crews rotated home or filled graves in foreign soil. The magnetrons hummed until they burned out, were replaced, hummed again. The war ended, and the technology persisted, evolving and proliferating, until the very idea of weather-dependent bombing became archaic, a relic of an age before microwaves and synthetic apertures and the electronic eyes that never blink. But in March 1943, over the Ruhr Valley, Lieutenant James Hartley did not know any of this future. He knew only that he could see through his scope what his eyes could not perceive. He knew that he could drop his bombs with something approximating aim, that his mission would not abort due to weather, that the device humming behind him extended his perception downward through the clouds. He toggled the release. The bombs fell. The formation turned for home, and beneath the clouds, unseen and unseeing, the earth received what the sky delivered, not with precision, not with perfection, but with the relentless consistency that only technology could provide. The magnetron had learned to see through clouds, and in learning that trick, that violation of what human eyes could do, it had given an air campaign the one gift that mattered most, the ability to strike anywhere, anytime, regardless of what the sky chose to hide. The clouds remained, but they no longer protected. They were merely weather, inconvenient, uncomfortable, but no longer decisive. The eye that never blinks had seen to that.